Well, good afternoon. Uh, this is the little video that I promised on verses 24 to 27 of Daniel 9, the prophecy of 70 weeks. And I've got to say, it might be more of a rambling discourse than just a little succinct video, but I will do my best, and I hope it can be helpful for you. I guess I want you to understand that I'm not going to have the last word on this here. I have been doing some reading and some thinking, and I want to share some of that with you. But most of all, I hope this will prompt you to go away and read and think for yourself, to seek to understand. I hope it will go away. It will prompt you to ask questions, to talk to people, and I welcome you coming and chatting to me about it, and I hope it will stir up your heart to have renewed faith in our great God who rules in history, and so that's my hope for you. And I think we need to, as we start, we just need to recognise that prophecy is meant to be helpful for us. Sometimes we may think, oh, grief, it just causes us more questions. Well, God means it for it to be helpful for us. As we come to his word, often we find ourselves in places like this. He gives us insight into the future. But we've got to understand that he doesn't give us that insight so that we will understand, have all the details of what will happen. Jesus made that clear for us. He said, you won't know the day or the hour. But he's given us this word, this insight, to build our faith and to build our trust in him. And we need to keep that big picture of prophecy in our mind. Sometimes it's very easy to just chase all the rabbit burrows, trying to understand how what we see in the Bible matches up with what we see in our world now. And I think if that's where we are, we have missed the point of prophecy a little bit. I think it's particularly the case in Daniel. As God's people, they're in exile, they're away from God's city and God's place of worship. And God wants to encourage his people with this prophecy. And as you look at verses 20 to 23 of your Bibles, that's very clear that God means for this to encourage his people and to give them hope. And I think as we look at verses 24 to 27, there are some clear things for us to understand. And those, I'll go through them very simply. Firstly, I think God wants to reassure his people here that they are not forgotten or cast aside, and that exile was coming to an end. That is something to make them celebrate. When we read in verse 24, 70 weeks are decreed, and that is then going to come to an end. We realise that the people of Israel are going to be very excited about that there is an end. It's not just going to go on forever. But we see here in verses 24 to 27 that God is making clear that the end of the exile and the return to Jerusalem, that won't be the complete fulfillment of God's plans for his people. Not at all. In fact, it's evident here in these verses that there is still a long haul ahead of them, and it will still involve plenty of trouble. And so I mentioned, as I preached on Daniel 9 the other day, that it is a long faithfulness that is required by God for his people. And then we see here that finally the end of the trouble will come, though. God's enemies will not prevail against him. God is ruling in history, and we can trust him with that history. And so we see those big things are good for us to hear now. It is good for us to hear that whatever our history is, whatever part of history we are in, we can trust God with history. And we've referred to that many times in Daniel. We can see as well that whatever part of history we are in, there will be trouble. Every generation finds themselves looking at that current generation and thinking, are we in the last days? And every generation finds that God says to them again, look, my people, will you be ready for the long haul of faithfulness? And so we just need to keep those big things in mind. But let's come to some of the details, because I know if you're watching this video, that's what you want, and I'll do my best. We need to just say, if you haven't worked it out already, it's one of the most debated passages in the Bible, and there are all sorts of different things being written about verses 24 to 27 of Daniel 9. I have been looking, and I've got surrounding me here on my desk 4 commentaries. And I need to say that each of those 4 commentaries all have a different view on these details. And so I don't think for a moment either that I am going to have the final last word, the correct word on it, and the definitive judgment. And I want to offer you humbly to think the same thing for yourself. You probably are not going to have the definitive word or understanding on this either. But that doesn't mean we shouldn't have a go at seeking to understand it. God means for us to get into his word and to seek to understand it as best we can. And as we do so, he means for that to be good for us. He means for us to grow in our love and our faith in him. And he means for his word to us to become more and more relevant and lively. And so I'm just keen to help you think about this and to ask questions of it. And I guess as we get into it, I want to read from one of these commentators, Dale Ralph Davis, and he offers something that I thought was very helpful, and that is just a whole list of questions that we might have about this passage. And he says, and I think that's a way of starting to look at it. He says, here's the first of the questions. What are these sevens or these weeks that are referred to? Are they just weeks, or are they weeks of years? Are they to be taken literally, as in 490 years, or in some symbolic way? Now we'll just pause there for a moment as you look at it and you read of verse 25 that there is this 7 weeks that are spoken of in verse 25, and we understand that as the time that Israel are in exile, and we understand that clearly because of the prophecy of Jeremiah, and Jeremiah speaks of Israel being in exile for 70 years. And so what we can say here with some clarity is that the 7 weeks referred to in verse 25 is at least roughly equivalent to 70 years. And so what we can understand is that the weeks may refer to years, or at least they refer to 77s. And that's why this commentator asks, well, is this weeks or weeks of years? And if we see them as 77s, we might end up at 70 years, which then in turn for 70 weeks becomes 490 years. Or we might see it as 70 periods of time, and that also is a reasonable way of interpreting it here. So are the weeks or years to be taken literally or in some symbolic way? We also then could ask, well, how are we to understand the fulfillment of the clauses that are here? For instance, to bring an end to rebellion that's mentioned in verse 24, to put an end to sin, to atone for iniquity. How do we understand those things? And there are a number of different ways we could understand that. We might also ask, is the most holy at the end of verse 24, is that a place, as is translated in the ESV here, or you could translate it as a person, that is also reasonable too. What word? That word that says to restore and rebuild Jerusalem. The verse 25, the going out of the word. What word is that is meant there? Is it a prophetic word, for example, from Jeremiah? Is it a decree of Cyrus in 538 BC that maybe Ezra 1 refers to? Is it the word of Artaxerxes the first in 458 BC, as in Ezra 7, or the same, or Artaxerxes as well in 445 BC, as Nehemiah 2 seems to mention? And so we're asking, well, what is the word here? Those are all reasonable interpretations of what that word is. And then the anointed one, that verse 25 refers us to here. The coming of an anointed one in verse 25, a prince. Is that referring to the Messiah, which seems natural, or to some other leader, which could also be the case? It might be an anointed king somehow. Then the 62 weeks, verse 26, after 62 weeks, is that a distinct segment of time, distinct from the 7, or is that to be combined with the 7? Now, as I read the commentators, that it seems to be reasonable to interpret that as distinct from the initial 7. So the 7 and the 62 makes up 69. But you can reasonably interpret that as just one period of time or two distinct periods of time. And then we get to verse 26. And it speaks of after the 62 weeks. And does that mean then that the rest of the verse describes what happens in verse 27? After the 62 weeks, an anointed one shall be cut off, and that's the same as what's happening in verse 27? Or does it imply that there is a gap between the end of the 67, the end of the 67, the end of the 62 weeks? Is there a gap between there and the start of the 70th week? So if I say that more clearly, is there a gap between 69 weeks and the start of the 70th week? That's a very reasonable question to ask. And then you might ask, well, who's that anointed one that is then mentioned in verse later in verse, where are we? Sorry, there's two anointed ones mentioned here. Yes, okay. Anointed one in verse 25, and then an anointed one in verse 26. Are they both the same person? The same anointed one? And that's a good question. And then the leader that is mentioned at the end of verse 26. An anointed one should be cut off and shall have nothing. And the people of the prince who is to come, this leader, is that who is that? And how should we understand that leader? Is it the anointed? And then I've got all sorts of questions here. Sorry. And then the end that comes for that leader at the end of verse 26, its end, that the people of the prince, its end shall come with a flood. Is that referring to the leader who is coming, or is it referring to the anointed one that's mentioned earlier? Is the covenant that's mentioned in verse 27, is that a positive thing or a negative thing? Is it beneficial or detrimental? Is it good when sacrifice and offering stop in verse 27, or is that bad? And so there are all these questions that come in 4 short verses 24 to 27. And then Ralph Davis goes on to say this, which I laughed at, and I'll share it with you. What does all this mean? It means that if you are driving home late at night and you tune into the prophecy hour on your radio and you hear the preacher refer to what is perfectly clear in Daniel's 70 weeks prophecy, you know he hasn't read the text carefully. And I had a chuckle of that. But it gives us some insight into the questions that are there for us. And as I've looked at it, I think there are 3 ways that you could understand this passage. I'm not going to try and go into all the details of how to answer all the things, because they fit to a degree into these 3 ways. And the 3 ways that I just want to share with you today are that, firstly, you could understand that this is a chronological period of time, and that these weeks and years here, they are chronological time periods. You could secondly understand it as they're interpreting it theologically. And these are theological time periods. They begin and end with theological markers, and we interpret it that way rather than strictly chronologically with a number of years. And thirdly, you could understand that as we look here at these events, they have multiple fulfillments in history. And that might be a way of doing it. I'll start with that one, the multiple fulfillments in history. And so the way you might look at it is that these events, they have a fulfillment in history back in the time of what has happened here. You could also understand that they have a fulfillment in history in Jesus coming as Messiah and the destruction of the temple in AD 70. And then you could understand that they have another fulfillment in history when Jesus returns. And so I'll give you what the commentator I'm reading says here, and that will help you to get what I'm saying. What am I saying? So, for instance, the anointed one who is mentioned in verse 26, some scholars view him to be Ananias III, the Jewish high priest who was murdered around 175 BC. But most Christian interpreters have understood him to be Jesus Christ. But there you have 2 possible levels of fulfillment. The second half of verse 26, which speaks of the destruction of the city and the sanctuary, the end coming with a flood and war and desolations, most likely that could be speaking of the destruction of the temple in AD 70. And particularly when you consider Matthew 24 and what Jesus says about the destruction of the temple, that makes some sense. But you could also plausibly interpret that as when Jesus returns. And so you could say, well, there is multiple fulfillments there. Cyrus is could be one of the interpretations of the word that goes out as a decree, but it could also be other fulfillments as well. And so he concludes by saying, plausible interpretations of Daniel 24 to 26 point us to the time of Cyrus, the cross of Jesus, AD 70, and the second coming of Christ. All appear valid, and any attempt to make only one of them the focus for the whole explanation will likely miss the richness of this text. And so that is one way you can look at this 70 weeks prophecy, that there are multiple fulfillments of what we see here. The second way you can look at it, and I think, to be fair, this is where most of you will be. I understand most in evangelical Christianity will be interpreting this 70 weeks prophecy chronologically, and so they you look at it and you say, well, look, this has a start point, and when it speaks here of 7 weeks, that lining up with Jeremiah's prophecy means 70 years. And then the 62 weeks, that is the remaining time to when Jesus comes. Let me just have a look here. That is when Jesus comes, and when you do that as a total, we have 490 years. I think I'm right there. From the decree to rebuild the temple. Yes, I think I'm right there with my total. So it is exactly the right number of years, and then there is this pause in verse 26. And the interpretation there is that we now are in the period of that pause. There is a pause between Jesus, his death and resurrection, and or the coming of the Messiah, however you want to look at it there. But there was a pause between the coming of the Messiah and the rapture, and that rapture from Thessalonians will initiate 7 years, 1 week of great tribulation, and then the second coming of Jesus will end the period of 70 weeks. That would be the chronological interpretation. Now, the difficulty I have with the chronological interpretation, and the question that needs to be thought about is where does the 70 weeks start? Take this, for instance. I read this. Where are we? The 70 years of Jeremiah's prophecy were not precisely 70 years. The fall of Babylon, by which the end or conclusion of Jeremiah's prophecy is reached, occurred in 539 BC. There are several suggested beginning points for the prophecy, but none of them add up to precisely 70 years. So it could be 612 BC when Nineveh fell, and that's 73 years. Could be 605 BC when Nebuchadnezzar ascended to the throne. That's 66 years. It could be the beginning of the captivity, 597 BC. That's 58 years. It could be the destruction of the temple and the city in 586 BC, and that's 47 years. And so the problem is, how do we get precisely 70 years? And that needs to be thought about. But then also the problem becomes, well, why do we have a pause between week 69 and week 70? If we have started the 70 weeks at a point and it is continued sequentially, why do we have a pause? And that pause, by the way, is just about 2,000 years now, from when Christ came to when at some point the last week will begin. And I think that's a question that needs to be asked for that interpretation. And that would be my question for that interpretation. There's many more we could talk about here. I'm conscious I'm already at 24 minutes, and I feel like you might be starting to tune out. Finally, I think you could consider and interpret this 70 weeks theologically, and I happen to think, as I look at Daniel 9, interpreting this theologically makes a lot of sense. I, I think, I guess the basic description of that view is that the weeks and the years described here are not precise. So as you read apocalyptic literature or prophecy, there are all sorts of instances, particularly in Daniel and Revelation, where you would understand the years or the time periods given in a symbolic or a figurative sense. They're not exact and literal. In the chronological interpretation, you will read them literally. In the theological interpretation, they won't be literal exactly. And so, as you do that, you, in this 70 weeks prophecy, you work with markers for the beginning of the end that correspond to what we see in these verses, rather than those exact periods of time. So the marker for the end of the 7 weeks is the decree of Cyrus. The start of the 7 weeks initially is Jerusalem going into captivity, or Israel going into captivity, Jerusalem being captured by the Babylonians, and then the decree of Cyrus ends that 7 weeks, and the 62 weeks then goes from the decree of Cyrus to basically Jesus' arrival, the coming of the Messiah. And that theological marker ends that period of time. And so it is a time of trouble. It is a time of rebuilding of the temple. And it fits with what we have here in the verses. And then the last week follows on after that, and the last week is I guess the time from Jesus' first coming to Jesus' second coming, and we are now in that last week. Now you might say, well, that's not much different to there being a pause between week 69 and week 70, and that could be the case if we were thinking that it has to be a specific period of time. But if we are thinking of the periods of time being determined by the time markers, well, I think it is credible. And so essentially, on the theological interpretation of the 70 weeks, the last week is happening now. We are in that last week now. It will be ended when Jesus returns. It significantly started with Jesus coming and the temple being destroyed, the end of sacrifices, and we as God's people are in that time period now. So I offer you that for the prophecy of the 70 weeks. I realise it's been long-winded. I suspected it might be. And I realise you probably have all sorts of questions and comments to make, and I'm quite okay with that. I don't believe, as I said, I don't believe for a moment that mine is the definite understanding of Daniel 9. And I also acknowledge that over time I have come to this view, and I want to encourage you in thinking about it, and I pray that it'll be helpful and good for you. Thanks for watching, and feel free to come and ask questions, give comments, but most of all, I encourage you to talk about it, to think about it, to pray about it, and seek to understand.